Now, admittedly, the government had an advantage over the strikers. They could and had spent months preparing to defend against the possibility of a general strike, while the TUC hadn't been able to similarly prepare because they'd have looked too aggressive, as though they were actively preparing for actually seeking to strike. But the point is that the government were well prepared. I'm going to look first, therefore, at why law and order was never truly at risk, and then at the support that the government could rely on from people around the country. So firstly, the government was able to make sure that law and order was never seriously threatened. One of the most famous moments of the general strike is of strikers playing football with policemen in Plymouth. It wasn't quite so peaceful everywhere. There were some serious clashes between pickets and police in some of the big cities like Newcastle and Glasgow. There were some disturbances in London. In fact, even Plymouth saw some rioting, which, as it happens, took place on the same day as the football match. But there was never any serious worry that the government had lost control of the situation. Parliament passed a series of emergency regulations which continued in force until the end of the coal dispute in December, and which gave the government increased power over, for example, the maintenance of food supplies and transport, as well as more draconian powers over agitators. The government also had the military to provide backup. Now, as it was, the military only played a minor role during the strike. The army was used to give protection to escorts of coal and food supplies in London, for example. But the military also had a psychological impact. In the northeast, 2 destroyers were sent to the Tees, and 2 destroyers and a submarine were sent to the Tyne. Middlesbrough's chief constable approved, and in a letter to the Home Office, he suggested that the Navy's presence was having a great moral effect on the inhabitants of Teesside. Nor was the loyalty of troops ever in doubt, despite widespread rumours of mutinies and stories that soldiers were deserting their positions to join their working class comrades. The government always remained confident, and their reports constantly reassured them that even units who were recruited from mining areas were often sympathetic towards the miners. Even though that was the case, they found that the general tone and spirit of the troops was excellent. Secondly, the government also had substantial support around the country and was able to benefit from a successful mobilisation of people against the strikers. One of the most famous bodies here was the Organisation for the Maintenance of Supplies, the OMS, which had been set up the previous year as an independent organisation, but which then put itself under the control of the government when the strike broke out. It was composed of volunteers, and actually it was fairly limited in its practical impact. It was mainly composed of middle or upper class volunteers, and of course most of these were unskilled in any kind of manual job. The OMS also played a role in the recruitment of special constables. In London, over 50,000 volunteers had been recruited as temporary policemen by the end of the strike. Again, not all of these were used, not all of these could have been used, there wasn't the need for them. But as with the OMS, such numbers were also of propaganda value. Class consciousness wasn't a phenomenon restricted to the working classes in this period. The middle and upper classes could be fiercely class conscious too. Ross McKibben has argued that in the 1920s, in the early 1920s, the middle classes were still influenced by the memory of the First World War, which had militarised their outlook on life and brought to the forefront the imagery of warfare and defence of the nation. At the end of May, therefore, the Dean of Durham Cathedral, J.E.C. Weldon, explicitly linked the two when he unequivocally condemned the general strike in words that were reproduced in the local press. It was but an evil shadow of the treachery of which the Germans were guilty when they invaded the borders of Belgium, was his damning verdict. Now, this imagery had a wider relevance. It could be argued that Stanley Baldwin's whole premiership had been characterised by an attempt to woo the working man, and indeed the working woman, in an age of universal suffrage. He attempted to win the support of the hard-working, honest, patriotic working man, and he portrayed the militantly class-conscious worker as deviant. In his rhetoric, trade unions were all part of the smooth and democratic running of the country. The only trouble came when they were subverted by a small minority of sinister-minded communists. This imagery was at its strongest during the period of the general strike. Throughout, the government attempted to marginalise the organisers of the strike and suggest that they didn't really represent true feeling in the country. In a radio bulletin broadcast on the 8th of May, for example, Baldwin invoked the power of such rhetoric. Can there be a more direct attack upon the community, he argued, than that a body, not elected by the voters of the country, without consulting the people, without consulting the trade unionists, and in order to impose conditions never yet defined, should dislocate the life of the nation and try to starve us into submission? He was talking about the trade union leaders. Such appeals were important. I've already discussed how careful the trade union leaders were, how worried they were that their actions might be seen as anti-constitutionalist. But these were also worries shared by ordinary people, ordinary working people, not just the Cambridge undergraduates who famously streamed from their ivory towers to man the trams. In fact, even amongst the miners themselves, at least some rank and file members also feared the political implications, at least of the general strike, if not of the miners' lockout. In some areas, including such mining and labour strongholds as South Wales and the northeast of England, even some miners themselves volunteered as special constables to support the government during the general strike, even though at the time they themselves were locked out and supportive of the miners' struggle. Furthermore, political objections aside, not all workers were prepared to give up wages or risk victimisation by supporting the miners. Despite organisations such as the OMS, most volunteer and blackleg labour came from the clerical and manual workforce and the pool of unemployed, which was of course more valuable usually to the government anyway, as they were more likely to possess at least some manual skills. So to sum up so far, we've seen how the strike was reluctantly called by a hesitant trade union leadership against a class-conscious and well-prepared government. In some ways, it was never going to succeed. And if we look at its aims, this becomes clearer. And so I want to finish by looking briefly at the strike's aims and assessing whether anything positive at all was achieved. The strike was called as a sympathetic strike in support of the miners' industrial struggle against the longer hours and lower wages that were being imposed upon them by the mine owners. Its aim was to get the government to intervene to prevent this. While there were a minority of activists who hoped that it would fulfil a more revolutionary agenda, for most of those involved, the general strike was never meant to be a political or a constitutional act. And here the British case differed from the continent, where the idea of the general strike had an important place in syndicalist and revolutionary theory. Stanley Baldwin, Prime Minister, had already given one subsidy to the coal industry in July 1925, and he'd been criticised by members of his government and by sections of the right-wing press for doing so. It wasn't politically possible to keep bailing out the coal industry indefinitely, whatever the suffering of the miners, whatever the pleas of the coal owners. In any case, the government was absolutely committed to not entering into any negotiations until the strike was called off. Even when the TUC representatives went to Downing Street on the 12th of May to meet the Prime Minister, they had to wait on the doorstep while it was verified that the strike had indeed ended. And neither mine owners or miners were likely to compromise either. Here were two intransigent sides, both with a history of confrontation, including in their recent past. There'd been disputes in the mines in 1920 and 1921. And indeed, if A.J. Cook would later blame the TUC leaders for the outcome of the strike, the TUC leaders would blame the intransigence of A.J. Cook and his mining colleagues, and their refusal to even consider the possibility of compromise. If the miners had agreed to the Samuel Memorandum, the trade union leaders argued, then the government would have been under much greater pressure to accept it. The mine owners came under similar pressure from the Conservatives. One Conservative peer famously commented in May 1926 that he'd always thought the miners' leaders were the stupidest men in Britain, but that had been until he'd met the mine owners. And indeed, it took until the end of November for one side to concede defeat, and then defeat was total. The miners went back to work on the owners' terms. Compromise wasn't really a possibility. So in its immediate aim to help the miners, the general strike failed utterly. This had been its most explicit purpose. The miners only returned to work 7 months later, to longer hours and to lower wages determined on a district-by-district basis. Their defeat was total. The strike had also caused considerable hardship for many of those involved. In the longer term, it weakened the trade union movement, financially and psychologically. There was some reduction in trade union membership, although this was likely anyway given the depression of the late 20s and 30s. And then the following year, the government passed the 1927 Trade Disputes Act and Trade Union Act, which prohibited future general strikes. It also changed the system of political funding to an opt-in one, meaning that henceforth trade unionists had to actively opt in to agree to pay a subsidy to the Labour Party, rather than it being an automatic process from which they had to opt out. It meant that the number of unionists paying a levy to the Labour Party had dropped to 2 million by 1929 compared to 3 million in 1927, with obvious implications on Labour Party funds. But the strike was not meaningless. There were certain tangible benefits in the long term. It had demonstrated the potential of the labour movement. It had been effective. It had attracted the sympathy and support of a large swathe of the population and had raised awareness of economic and political issues. The consequent rise in class consciousness, it could be argued, also had repercussions for the 1929 Labour victory. And actually, it had caused considerable financial cost to both government and employers. Neither were keen to embark upon another battle with organised labour any time soon. So to sum up this lecture then, why did the general strike not succeed? Well, first I looked at two main reasons. One was the position of the trade union leadership. These men feared the revolutionary implications of the strike and feared what might happen if they lost control. Their hesitancy led to minor organisational problems, but more importantly, it meant that they eagerly called off the strike as soon as they had the opportunity. Secondly, I looked at the position of the government, who were firstly able to ensure that law and order was never seriously threatened, but perhaps more importantly, were able to maintain the support of a substantial section of the population. This wasn't just the middle and upper classes who were the natural allies of a Conservative government against the strikers, but also a significant section of the working classes as well. But in some ways, the strike's aims were doomed from the start, and this was my final point. It was an attempt to persuade the government to intervene in an industrial dispute in the coal industry, and the government had made clear that it was never going to do this. However, although in its immediate aims the general strike did not succeed, it wasn't meaningless. It meant that in the economic hard times of the 1930s, there were at least elements of both sides who were more prepared to cooperate in the interests of industrial peace.